Psachim Daf Nun Daled, as well as Tainis Daf Lamed, describes the essence of Tisha B'Av in two very different ways. The Gemara Psachim teaches us that Tisha B'Av is similar to Yom HaKippurim. It ain't ben Tisha B'Av the Yom HaKippurim, ela shezeh sfeiko osur v'zeh sfeiko muter. Tisha B'Av in essence is a Tainis Tzibur. Yom Kippur, of course, is min Torah, not the case when it comes to Tisha B'Av. However, in essence, the very nature of Tisha B'Av is patterned after Yom HaKippurim itself. When you look in the Gemara in Tainis and Daf Lamed, there the Gemara tells us a very different dimension regarding Tisha B'Av, that kol mitzvos hanoagos ba'avel noagos b'Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av is considered to be a time of absolute avelus. And that is a stunning contrast when it comes to Yom Kippur. True, Yom Kippur is a time of Tainis Sibur, but Yom Kippur is a day of great, great simcha. After all, lo hayom tovim Yisroel, Tisha B'Av Yom HaKippurim. Yom Kippur is a time that we rejoice. The essence, the definition of simcha, the Gemara Vayichan Daf Yedalid, is v'samachta lifnei Hashem Elokecha, to be in the presence of Kadosh Baruch Hu. There the Gemara describes that you don't find avelus when it comes to a Kohen Gadol, because a Kohen Gadol positions himself to be always bifnei Hashem. And if the essence of being bifnei Hashem is what is true of simcha, we understand when it comes to Yom Kippur, lifnei Hashem titaru. Rachmana litzlan, if a person is an avelus, the onset of Yom Kippur would sever Shiva, would sever Shloshim, because after all, Yom Kippur is a time of tshuva, but it's an opportunity. It's a time of great simcha as well. So on the one hand, Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur are similar in the sense that, yes, both are considered to be a Tainis Tzibur. On the other hand, Yom Kippur is a time of great simcha. And obviously that cannot be said when it comes to the time of Tisha B'Av. But yes, many parallels between Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av itself. There's a stunning comment to the Rambam Pirush Mishnayis in Mesechus Tainis in Perek Dalid Mishnah Vav, where the Rambam writes that there's a mitzvah of Tosefes Yom HaKippurim. That, of course, is a Gemara Yuman Daf Be'alev, one is obligated to begin Yom Kippur early. It's striking, when you look in the Rambam, there's a mitzvah of Tosefes Yom HaKippurim, but the Rambam never mentions a mitzvah of Tosefes Shabbos or a mitzvah of Tosefes Yantiv. Indeed, the Magen Mishnah writes in Perek Daled Hilchos Chanukah that according to the Rambam, there is no mitzvah of Tosefes Shabbos, that lo matzinu Kabbalah oseres. Apparently, the Rambam understood that Tosefes Yom HaKippurim is not a halach in Kedushas Hayom that can be transferred to Shabbos or Yantiv. If it's not a halach in the Kedushas Hayom, so what is it? Perhaps v'nisim es nafsho seichem. The Rambam only stresses Tosefes Yom Kippur when it comes to Inuyim. And therefore, according to the Rambam Shita, that Tosefes is midin Inui. Tosefes is Dine Tainis Tzibur. And therefore, not somewhat surprising that the Rambam doesn't have Tosefes Shabbos, doesn't have Tosefes Yantiv, but that Rambam, Pirush Mishnayis Perek Dalid, Mishnah Vav and Mesechus Tainis, has Tosefes Tisha B'Av, after all, because Tisha B'Av is patterned after the Dine Tainis Tzibur of Yom HaKippurim itself. So on one hand, clearly that Tisha B'Av is a time of Tainis Tzibur. But as I mentioned, that marked stunning contrast that Yom Kippur is a day of great simcha, lifnei Hashem titaru. And yet, when it comes to Tisha B'Av, tragically, that is a time of profound avelus. So if one were to ask you, why is it that on Tisha B'Av you're not eating and drinking? The answer is because Psachim Daf Nun Daled, it's a Tainis Tzibur, similar to, patterned after the time of Yom HaKippurim. If a person were to ask you, why in Tisha B'Av didn't you put on tefillin in the morning? Why is it that you're sitting on the floor? The answer is Tainis Daf Lamed, because after all, Dine Avelus. And if a person, for example, were to ask you that why is it that you're refraining, for example, from washing on Tisha B'Av, there the answer is two sugis. Psachim Daf Nun Daled, Tainis Daf Lamed. After all, they're two different moving parts. On the one hand, there's an isser of rechitza because it's a Tainus Sibur, similar to that of Yom Kippurim. On the other hand, there's an Isser of Rechitza because it is a day of Avelus. And therefore, what's driving, for example, the Isser of Rechitza are two different elements. That's Sugya Psachim, as well as the Sugya in Tainus. If you look in the Tshuvas of the Tashbetz and Chelet Beis and Simrei Shain Aleph, the Tashbetz stresses these two dinim, the dual nature of Tisha B'Av. On the one hand, Tainus Sibur, on the other hand, the din of Avelus. The Minchas Chinuch in Shin Yud Gimel writes that there could be a difference in the quality of Rechitza. After all, when it comes to Yom Kippur, the Isser is even a Hoshit Etzba'o B'mayim. It's not really washing one's entire body, but even a single limb, even a single finger, is considered to be that which is Asr. That is not typically true when it comes to Avelus, but that is true when it comes to Yom Kippur. So therefore, if a person is engaging in Rechitza of a hand, a finger, Miktas Aguf, that is a violation of the parallel of Tisha B'Av Yom Kippurim. What about when it comes to this Rechitza of Tainus Daf Lamed, of Dine Avelus? That applies to Rechitza of Kol Haguf. And therefore, the quality of the Isser of Rechitza is different, whether it is based on the parallel to Yom Kippur, the parallel of Avelus. This is the Chiddush that Briskov points out as well, Nochos Tanios. Perhaps one could suggest the following distinction, that what exactly happens when Tisha B'Av falls out on Shabbos? One does not fast on Shabbos. That's only true of Yom Kippur because that is the Tainus Sibur Min HaTorah. But now the Tainus is a Nidche. The fasting, of course, will be on Sunday. Are there any elements that would nonetheless apply on that Shabbos of Tisha B'Av, even though that the fast itself is postponed until the next day? Perhaps the Lundas, the Haftorah, would be as follows. In terms of the Dinei Tainus Sibur, that is something that is deferred. That is something indeed is postponed, that we fast on Sunday. But what about the element of Avelus? After all, that there is Avelus on Shabbos. By definition, one of the days of Shiva, of course, is Shabbos. Not full-blown Avelus, but Dvarim Shevitzina. Certain elements indeed apply on the Shabbos itself during Shiva. And perhaps one could suggest that following distinction, that when Tisha B'Av falls on Shabbos, it's true that elements that are a function of the Tainus Sibur, the eating, the drinking, the fasting, that is something that is commemorated on Sunday. However, the elements of Avelus could still be in place when it comes to Shabbos itself. And therefore, for example, when it comes to the Isser of Rechitza, those elements of Rechitza that are a function of Tainus Sibur, even Mitzvah Saguf, even a single Aver, that will apply on Sunday. But the Rechitza Shel Tanakh of Kol Haguf, which is a function of Avelus, that will apply even when it comes to the Shabbos itself. And therefore, the Briskov suggests that maybe that very distinction between the two dinim is applicable when a person is experiencing a Tisha B'Av Shechal b'Shabbos. There is a stunning comment that the Rambam has in Torah Sa'adam, in Inyan Avelus Yishana, where the Ramban writes the following, that the Isser of Rechitza and Sicha on Tisha B'Av already begin before Shkia. It already begins Mi Ba'od Yom. And the Rosh is quite bothered. How can that possibly be? The Rosh in Tainus, in Perek Dalet, Siman Lamed Ches, asked the obvious question, V'davar Teimahu, Achilan Shtiyah, eating and drinking, which is the most severe. That is allowed, Mi Ba'od Yom. Tisha B'Av, as a result, has not yet begun, but yet there's an Isser of Sicha, there's an Isser of Rechitza. How can we argue that the Isser of Rechitza and Sicha, which fails to eating and drinking, that already begins earlier on Erev Tisha B'Av, and yet the Isser of eating and drinking only applies on Tisha B'Av itself? How indeed could that possibly be? And therefore the Rosh tells us this Ramban is very, very difficult. The Davar Teimuhu. Briskov points out perhaps this is exactly the answer. Even though it's true that the Dinei Tainus Sibur of eating and drinking, that applies on the day of Tisha B'Av itself. But you know what? Elements of Avelus begin even even mi ba'od yom, from the time of, for example, Sulam of Sekes, elements of Avelus could indeed kick in. And therefore, even though it sounds somewhat ironic, but not a contradiction at all, Achil and Shtia, which is a function of Tanya Sibur, that begins on Tisha B'Av proper. However, Rechitza Sicha, which is a function of Avelus, the Avelus already begins Mibod Yom. I would just add the following. When you look in that Ramban in Torah Sada, and the Ramban describes the Isser of Rechitza Mibod Yom when it comes to Tisha B'Av, the Ramban is explicit that includes even Panav, Yadav, Veraglov, even that is Asr, Mibod Yom. Apparently, even that has an element of Avelos. That's a Chiddush that the Ritva writes in Tainus and Daf Yud Gimel, that even though typically speaking, when it comes to personal Avelos of a Yochid, then yes, that there's certain leniency when it comes to the cases of Rechitza of Mikzas Aguf, but not true. When it comes to a case of the Avelos Yishana, Avelos Terabim, there, perhaps even Rechitzas Mikzas Aguf, the Ritva writes, is not only Asr Midin Tanis Sibur, but that is even Asr because of elements of Avelos itself. But these are the two elements of Tisha B'Av, an unusual, a unique confluence. On the one hand, a time of Tanis Sibur, but also a day of Avelos. Typical Avelos is not coupled with Tanis Sibur. And the model Midarais of Tanis Sibur of Yom Kippurim is not coupled with elements of Avelos. And that is the uniqueness of the Chaloshim Yom when it comes to the day of Tisha B'Av, to experience simultaneously a Tanis Sibur and a time of Avelos. Rav Soloveitchik would often comment that, isn't this clear from the Kriyas Torah of Tisha B'Av and the Haftorah? When it comes to the Kriyas Torah, there, Betzar L'cha Metzucha, V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha, we speak about the essence of tshuva. Isn't that Kiyom HaKippurim, the Sugim Psachim? After all, the Rambam writes in Achos Tanios, the very essence of a Tanios is Liftoach Levalos B'darchei HaTshuva. It's an opportunity. It's not only about the fasting, but rather an opportunity to become closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. And that is the essence of Yom Kippur. And therefore not surprising that V'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha, that is the very Kriyas Torah of the day of Tisha B'Av itself. And all of a sudden you come to the Haftorah. Asof Asifin, Kiru L'Makonanos. The Haftorah are those elements of Avelos. And perhaps that juxtaposition, that convergence, that confluence of Tanis Sibur Kama Kippurim, but also Din Avelos, is evident in the very essence of the relationship between the Kriyas Torah and the Haftorah itself. And perhaps one of the dimensions of Avelus when it comes to Tisha B'Av is the Isser of Talmud Torah. The Gemara describes in Tainus and Daf Lamed that we realize that the vast corpus of the Torah Hashem is off limits. One can only learn Dvarim Harayim during the time of Tisha B'Av, and only to do that in a superficial and a cursory fashion. Why exactly is that true? Rashi stresses it's because of the element of Simcha. V'kudi Hashem Yishan is Samchei Lev. Rashi interprets the Mishnah is not only referring to Tinoko Shalais Rabbam, but rather, generally speaking, what is driving the Isser of Talmud Torah is because of the Simcha that elicits. If you look, for example, in Marsha writes simply it's because of a Hesach Hadas. You can have a lapse in awareness between the essence of what Tisha B'Av represents. And imagine if a person's going to spend the day immersing himself in the Torah Hashem, aside from any element of Simcha, but that would result in a lapse, in a Hesach Hadas. In fact, why is it that one is allowed to learn Dvarim Harayim during the time of Tisha B'Av? According to Rashi, it's because that is not Ma'or Simcha. According to the sheet of the Marsha, that is not a Hesach Hadas. The Dvarim Harayim that describe what Tisha B'Av is not at all a Hesach Hadas, but rather that is most appropriate to engage in during the time of Tisha B'Av itself. But perhaps what is driving the Isra of Talmud Torah, aside from Simcha, aside from Mount of Hesach Hadas, is the Avelu Sheba. After all, an Ovel also does not have free reign to be able to immerse himself in the Torah Hashem. And therefore, perhaps this is true when it comes to Tisha B'Av, that we express the time that this is an Eisara, this is a time of Hester Panim, this is a time of Sosam Tfilasi, and therefore we don't say Tiskabos Losan often when it comes to a Kaddish on Tisha B'Av. And similarly, that link that we have to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the Torah Hashem, after all, as the Ramban writes, the Torah Hashem is Shmos for Shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What greater element of Avelus is there that one does not have free reign to be able to celebrate through Limud HaTorah? And therefore, what is driving this sort of Talmud Torah is Simcha, Hesach Hadas, but also that is a profound manifestation of Avelus itself. And perhaps this can be understood as well in light of what the Gemara tells us in the Nedarim, that Alma of the Haaretz, that what indeed was the catalyst for the Churban Habayis. And there the Gemara answers, Shalom Bavarchin B'Torah Tchila, that Bnei Yisrael didn't properly recite Bircas HaTorah. It wasn't about the Bircas HaTorah, as the Ran Nedarim explains in Daf Pei Aleph, but rather, La'aya Divrei Torah Chashuv B'neihem. They didn't revere the privilege, the opportunity of Asek B'Torah. And therefore, that was the catalyst for the Churban Habayis. There's a stunning comment of the Chassid Yavetz, where the Chafetz Yavetz is bothered by that stira. Then on one hand, the Gemara tells us in the Nedarim, because of Birchas HaTorah, and the failure to revere the Torah Hashem, that is the catalyst of Churban Habayis. But we know by Yisroel, the Sugim of Tes, was because of the Averos HaChamuros. So what was it? Was it the Averos HaChamuros, or was it our failure to be able to revere, to cherish the opportunity of Asek B'Torah? The Chafetz Yavetz, in his Pirush Maseches Avos, answers that there is a mashal of a person who committed a capital offense, and he was about to be put to death by the court. And all of a sudden, the king arrived, and the king besieged the court, arguing that this is my Bamanagin, this is my musician. After all, whenever the king says, I feel a certain way, whenever I'm about to go into exact a certain sense of punishment, all of a sudden I listen to the beautiful music and somehow I'm appeased. And therefore, how can you possibly take away my Bamanagin, my musician? And the court granted that individual a temporary stay. All of a sudden later in life, that individual, that Bamanagin, that musician, was no longer able to play that beautiful music. He was summoned out to the court. In principle, you were guilty of a capital offense. You were granted a temporary stay because of the role that you served. And now that you're no longer able to perform that role, so now we have to enforce that punishment. Chassid Yavetz writes that that's the resolution between these two sugyas. It's true that Averos HaChamuros, that is what justified the Churban of Yisroel. But yet, Kol Zman, the Bnei Yisroel were able to play the beautiful music before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They were Osek B'Torah Lishma. That was Ma'orer Rachamei Shamayim. But all of a sudden now, Lahim Avarchin B'Torah Tchila. Bnei Yisrael stopped doing so. They no longer played that beautiful music. The Divrei Torah was not Lishma. Lahaya Divrei Torah Chashuvim B'neihem. And therefore, all of a sudden now, that temporary stay came to an end. And now we were punished with the Churban Habayis. Shlahayim Levarchim B'Torah Tchila. Perhaps one can understand that Gemara as well in light of a question that the Sefer HaChinuch raises in Mitzvah Taf Lamed. Mitzvah Taf Lamed is the Mitzvah Birchas Hamazon. And there the Sefer HaChinuch points out a stunning contrast. He writes that both Bircas Hamazon as well as Bircas HaTorah are min HaTorah. And both, as the Rambam writes, have elements, of course, of Shavach V'Hodah. We thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the food that we eat in Bircas Hamazon, and the Rambam describes in Osafos and Sefer Mitzvos that Bircas HaTorah is an opportunity to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for Kabbalah HaTorah. And the Sefer HaChinuch raises a very simple issue that when is the ideal time to recite a Bircas HaTorah? Is it before or is it after? And the stunning contrast that when it comes to Bircas Hamazon, the Hodah is la'achar, ha'achila. When it comes to Bircas HaTorah, the Hodah is kodem, halimud. And if both are considered to be a form of Hodah, that why is it that one is before and one is after? The Sefer HaChinuch writes that there's a marked, profound difference between Hanas HaNefesh and Hanas HaGuf. When it comes to physical sustenance, we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu after the fact, after we eat. But not true when it comes to the Hanas HaNefesh. The Nefesh rejoices at the opportunity of Eisek HaTorah. When it comes, for example, to eating, why is it that we thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu? I will tell you, it's not because of the act of eating, the Ma'aseh Achila, but rather it's because of the impact, the effect, the Hanas Hasiyah, an incredible suffix in Rabbi Kiva. Imagine, for example, a boy is almost bar mitzvah, and he eats as a katan. He benches as a katan. But now, guess what? Shkia says he's soveya as a gadol. Rabbi Kiva raises the suffix that maybe he's obligated to bench again, because now he's obligated in Bircas Hamazon as the bar chiyuv midaraisa because of the Hanas Hasiyah. Even though the Ma'aseh Achila was Mibon Yom, Rabbi Kiva writes perhaps the same thing applies when it comes to an oning. A person eats before the Klura, but he is still sustained, satiated. Lachar HaKlura. Perhaps the Bircas Hamazon is on the Hanas Hasiyah, not just simply the Ma'aseh Achila. It's not about the act of eating. It's on the effect, the impact of eating. And therefore, the brach is la'achar ha'achila. If I were to ask when it comes to Eisek B'Torah, is Eisek B'Torah transformative? Is Eisek B'Torah impactful? The effect of learning, of course, an infinite effect. But it's not simply about its impact, about its effect, but rather the act of Eisek B'Torah in and of itself. Kishem Hashem Ekra, Havogol Elokeinu, Kol Makom Asher Azker Shmi, it is absolutely the act itself, which is of infinite worth, of infinite value. And therefore, one is going to wait until after? How can that possibly be? We thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not really for the effect of learning, but for the privilege of Eisek B'Torah. And therefore, Bircas HaTorah is before. If we were simply to recite Bircas HaTorah afterwards, it's as though we're simply equating the act of Limud HaTorah with the act of eating, with Hanas HaGuf, not Hanas HaNefesh. And that somehow is such a negative indicator about how it is that we perceive the privilege, the opportunity of Eisek B'Torah. I would just add, perhaps that also is relevant to that Sugnidarim. It's not that they didn't recite Bircas HaTorah. Shlohim Avarchin B'Torah, one more word, Tchila. It wasn't over l'asiyasa. Over l'asiyasa means that you revere the privilege of. And here I would suggest that that's part of the Isser of Talmud Torah during the time of Tisha B'Av. Sometimes, unfortunately, in life, you don't realize how precious something is, how privileged you are, until it's taken from you. Isn't that true often of relationships? And that's true of Eisek B'Torah. And therefore, how it is that we see the profound vacuum of an inability to be able to Eisek B'Torah when that is taken away from us. You go through a day without free reign in the Torah Hashem. And you know what? That posits dine avelus. What greater avelus is there than not being able to reach out to HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the realm of Asek Bator? I always tell my Bnei Mishpacha, my Talmidim, what's the first thing that you do when Tisha B'Av comes to an end? And if the answer is that immediately you sit down to eat, and immediately you sit and wash, I don't think that's the right answer. Imagine you go through an entire day without the privilege of free reign in the Torah Hashem. So you know what? The first thing to do, Chos Limudah, a window of time, learn as soon as Tisha B'Av is over. And let the Hanasa go be satisfied just a little bit later. But that purity speaks volumes in terms of how we revere the opportunity, the privilege, the simcha of Asek B'Torah in its fullest sense. And therefore, we can return to the beautiful music that HaKadosh Baruch Hu waits for us to play. You know, one of the marked differences between personal Avelus as opposed to Avelus Derabim is simply the sequence. The sequence. How is it that Avelus progresses? Is it Menakala Kaved, Menakaved Lakar? Is it something that begins most intensely and then diminishes? Or is it something that grows in its intensity? And isn't this a difference between individual Avelus as opposed to Avelus Derabim? When it comes to individual Avelus, and then we experience the Mishamei Samut Lefanav. We experience the time of Aminus. We experience the first day of Avelus according to Shitas Rambam Daraisa. And then the Avelus diminishes. Minakavid alakal, Shiva, Shlosh, Yibes Chodesh. The opposite, of course, is true when it comes to Avelus Derabim. We begin with 3 weeks and 9 days, Shua Shachalba, and then we experience the time of Tisha B'Av itself. And perhaps that sequence is an incredible indicator in terms of our challenge. The challenge of personal Avelus and the Avodah, the challenge of Avelus Derabim. When it comes to personal Avelus, what exactly is the Avodah? What is the challenge? Here I would argue, it's not to prepare for Avelus, but rather it's to respond to Avelus. You know, even if a person recognizes that someone is gravely, gravely ill, but you know, a person becomes an Ava, you're never ready. It's always a shock. Somehow you're taken by surprise. You don't prepare for Avelus. The challenge is to respond to Avelus. And how do you respond? With a sense of Tziduk Kadin, with Emunah and Bitachon. And since we're called upon to respond, Min HaKaved, Elakal, so therefore the Avelus is most intense at the time of the Tira, and as time goes on, the Avelus diminishes. But if you were to ask me that what is the challenge of the 3 weeks and the 9 days and Shusha Chab and Tisha B'Av, it's not just simply to respond, but rather, Kiyom HaKippurim, it's to prepare. Yom Kippur requires Sachana. It requires a Chodesh Elul. It requires Rosh Hashanah. It requires Aseret Shemei Tshuva. You have to position yourself in order to experience Yom Kippur. And here I will tell you as well, that's why the progression is as such when it comes to Tisha B'Av. Because the avodah is not to be caught off guard. The avodah is to prepare. Achana. Because tshuva is necessary. After all, Liftoach halavavos b'darchi hatshuva. Tisha B'Av has the dinim of Yom HaKippurim. The very essence, the Kriyas HaTorah, is v'shavta ad Hashem Elokecha. And therefore, in both realms, both Benad Lamakom, as well as Benam Chavera, the need to see to it that we redirect, that we reposition ourselves, that we're choser b'tshuva, that we recognize what is necessary in order to see to it that we'll be zochet to the time of Binyan Beis Hamikdash. The Rambam describes that Geula is Malas Avosam Yeshuvu, found in Mamad Har Sinai in Binyan HaMishkan, a time of Hashras Hashchina, but also a time of Achdus, of all of Knesset Yisrael, Vayichan Shem Yisrael, Ish Echad, B'Lev Echad, Daveros HaChamuros Abayis Rishon, the Sinas Chinam Abayis Sheni. Both elements, both domains have to be addressed as part of the Hachana to be able to properly experience in a meaningful way the essence of Tisha B'Av. So yes, two very different sugyas. On the one hand, Tisha B'Av similar to the time of Yom Kippurim. On the other hand, a time of dire and absolute Avelus, but with an incredible Haftorah. The silver lining of Karlei Moed. And Be'ezras Hashem, we look forward to the time where the Avelus of Tisha B'Av comes to an end, and we're able to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash, to welcome Bias Kol Tzedek, B'mei Rav Yonasan.